Thank you very much, Dr. Burrell. And our last panelist for today is Dr. Gallia Lindenstrauss, who is also, like myself, a research associate here at the Institute for National Security Studies. Dr. Gallia Lindenstrauss lectures also at Tel Aviv University, at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. Her main field of study is Turkish foreign policy. She completed her PhD in the Department of International Relations at Hebrew University, and she's the author of a number of publications on Turkish foreign policy, including the last Mediation and Engagement, a New Paradigm for Turkish Foreign Policy and its Implication for Israel, which was published here at INSS. And Gallia is going to talk about Turkish-Syrian relations and where are they heading, as you can see.
Thank you. Just allow me one word of thanks before starting. First of all, I want to thank Amos for encouraging me with this initiative. I think, as Arad said, it's very important that there will be better understanding in Israel of what is happening in Turkey, and I hope this is a humble contribution. This conference is a humble contribution to this effort. I would also like to thank the participants who came from far and near, for coming, for the chairs who did marvelous work, for Mr. Kobi Pinchas, who is here and taking care of us, and for Mrs. Deborah Oppenheimer, who was really very helpful in organizing this conference. Okay, that's all the thanks. And for the audience, of course. Okay. So I want to be a bit future-oriented, and I want to talk about Turkish-Syrian relations. Where are they heading? But of course, to understand where are they heading, we first have to understand what went wrong, okay? Beyond the obvious that there was the Arab awakening, what went wrong in Turkish-Syrian relations, and what are Turkish main motivations with regard to Syria? Then I will briefly touch about future scenarios for Syria, because of course we have to understand what's the future for Syria, because this has very important implications for all the neighbors, but specifically for Turkey. And lastly, I will discuss Turkish diplomatic and military options with regard to Syria. So first thing first is, how did we get from here? And this is Erdogan and Assad in Damascus, October 2008. Unfortunately for Erdogan and Assad, these images keep on popping up in Twitter and Facebook. And I think this is very reflective to the honeymoon period in Turkish-Syrian relations. Basically, the first decade of the 21st century was this honeymoon period. So how did we get from here to here? I could have given you an image of Turkish tank on the Syrian border, but I chose two very illustrative quotes, I think. So first of all, Erdogan to Assad, a year ago, November 2011, in a public speech, he says, "For the welfare of your own people in the region, just leave that seat. If you want to see someone who has fought until death against his own people, just look at Hitler, at Mussolini. If you can't draw any lessons from these, then look at the Libyan leader. The Libyan leader was just killed a month earlier." And now something from the last month, Assad on Russian television, while being asked on Erdogan, he says, he, Erdogan, personally thinks that he is the new Sultan of the Ottoman, and he can control the region as it was during the Ottoman Empire under a new umbrella. In his heart, he thinks he's a caliph. Well, actually, if we conclude from this conference, many presentations did talk about the neo-Ottoman tendency of the AKP. So, in some respects, this is to the point, but of course, this is very, in terms of the relations between the two, this is of course a very bold statement on behalf of Assad. So what went wrong? Again, beyond the obvious that the Arab awakening happened. First of all, there were false assumptions. The Turks had false assumptions. At first, they pressured Assad to perform major reforms, and unsurprisingly, this didn't work. This false assumption was the first one. Later, when they understood this is pointless, they thought Assad's fall would be quick. Okay, this was not only a Turkish assumption, it was also in Israel, in the West. Many thought that Assad's fall would be quick, and this was a wrong assumption. Another problem was Russia's and Iran's strong backing for Assad. Now, this meant two things. First of all, in terms of Russia, this meant that there couldn't be no action, Security Council-led action. So this was one issue, and this was the preferred route from the Turkish perspective, that there will be multilateral action vis-à-vis Syria. Another problem, and this was also discussed in this conference by other speakers, is that there are limits to Turkish willingness to confront these two actors. Turkey is very dependent on energy from these two actors, and there are other reasons why Turkey does not. There's limits to where Turkey is willing to confront these two actors. Another issue that the Turks have been disappointed is the limited response from the West. They were hoping for something more serious, but nobody really wants to intervene in Syria. They have voiced their disappointment with the UN, the Security Council. We see now many Turkish statements that the Security Council should be reformed. This is nothing new. There have been other actors that have called for the reform of the Security Council, but this is now very strong in Turkish rhetoric, and it does mean that there is some disappointment in this respect. Another problem was the flow of the refugee flow. The Turks said that they could only absorb, at some point they said they could only absorb 100,000 refugees. They have long passed this refugees. They have now 120,000 refugees, and the refugee flow is continuing. So they have this big refugee flow. Again, a sense that they are the only ones who are not the only ones who are dealing with it, but there's no help from the West in dealing with these refugees. And also, interestingly, and this is similar to what happened in the first Gulf War of 1991, the Turks want to stop this flow of refugees to some extent, and they're raising demands of a humanitarian corridor, of safe havens, that basically means somewhat Kurdish autonomy, which is giving the Kurds more strength in Syria and in the region. And in general, when we talk about Turkish-Syrian relations, we have to remember that this honeymoon I discussed earlier, the honeymoon of the first decade of the 21st century, is actually the exception. Most of the Turkish-Syrian relations were relations of enmity. So in this respect, we are somehow returning to normality in some respects. Now, why did Turkey change its stance towards Syria? What are Turkish main motivations? First of all, and this was also emphasized by previous speakers, and Zvi Barel also touched upon it in this panel, there is the element of ethics, there is the element of moral foreign policy. It's a part, I mean, at least rhetorically, it's there. It's part of Turkey's policy towards the Arab Spring, basically embracing this positive development in their eyes. It's true that Bahrain was an exception, but with regard to the other Arab Spring states, it's basically been an embrace of these revolutions. And in this respect, supporting the Syrian opposition is in line with this policy. Another issue is that Turkey, the Sunni-Shia divide. Of course, Turkey is standing behind the Sunni majority in Syria. That's one aspect of this story. Another aspect that both the Saudis and to a lesser extent Iran are basically pushing Turkey to choose its sides to find its place in this Shiite-Sunni struggle, which of course in this respect it should be in the Sunni camp. And this is something that Turks have tried to avoid, but somehow Syria has made it much more difficult, and also Iraq has made it much more difficult to stay out of this struggle. Another element, again raised yesterday, raised today, the Kurdish factor. It's always there. There's always the fear, this basic fear of Kurdish independence. And as I said, the refugee flows are making the Kurds in northern Syria more autonomous. Also developments in Iraq, the feeling that the Kurdish regional government in Iraq is trying to push for more independence because it's not happy with the central government in Iraq. So all this combined with a Kurdish spring in Turkey that we have discussed, that the level of Kurdish violence is very high compared to previous years. All this is also pushing the Turks to say to their traditional reflexes of trying to control the Kurdish problem by security means, and that means also Syria. Of course, also we can't ignore Turkey's relations with the West, specifically the US. Historically speaking, we see all the time, constantly, that Turkey is assessing NATO's commitment to it. It has the second strongest army in NATO. It doesn't need to go to NATO to ask for assistance, but it asked for consultation in NATO. There was even talks of them invoking Article 5 of the treaty. So this constant checking, is NATO truly committed to us? Also, in this respect, we should highlight that Turkey is basically likes to work multilaterally. This has been also a traditional emphasis in Turkish foreign policy, that if possible, we should work in multilateral forums. Another issue is, here going to the personal issue, the feeling of personal betrayal. Okay, Erdogan treated Assad to many respects like a brother. Turkey invested much energy in Syria. I'm not saying much money, but invested much energy in Syria and in boosting these relations. And they thought that Assad should do whatever they say to him, and of course he didn't do that. So there was this feeling of personal betrayal. And the last issue, it's not related to Turkey. It's related to be just that Turkey is a neighboring state to Syria. And there's a difficulty of staying distant from things that are happening in a neighboring state. We saw this week with Israel and Syria. When you have instability in a neighboring state, this affects you. On the other hand, you're of course afraid that you will be dragged into a very messy intervention and be seen as a conqueror or seen as an invasion. Future scenarios for Syria. I'm not a Syrian expert. Our best Syrian expert is our chair. But just to give some thinking of where we're going. So first of all, I said future scenarios for Syria. Maybe this is just future scenarios for northern Syria, because from the Turkish perspective, the main interest is northern Syria. So what most analysts say, the most likely scenario is a protracted civil war. That we will see what we have today, even more intensive for the next few years. Okay, that it will be several years of protracted civil war. Another scenario is that the opposition forces will take over. That it will be complete takeover. Again, maybe not Syria, but in several provinces. And again, I'm focusing on northern Syria. Another option that the Turks have tried to promote to some degree is that there will be some sort of, I wrote transitional government, maybe it will not, the government isn't the right term, but there will be some transitional institution that will also include Baas party elements. Okay, Assad will be out of the picture, asylum, he will be killed, I don't know. Assad will be outside, but it won't be complete regime change. It will also include some party elements. Some say this is completely, that this will never work, but the Turks have played with this idea. And the last scenario is that now, again, you see more analysts speaking this way, is that with all the forecast that he will fall, Assad will remain in power. Okay, but even if he remains in power, we're talking about a very weak Assad. Okay, it's not going to be the same as it was before. So what are Turkey's options? And I'll start with the diplomatic, and then I'll move to the military. Well, first of all, as again Zvi very nicely put it, in the Doha meeting, basically Turkey was sidelined. And it's true, Turkey no longer plays a major role in this process, but Turkey has embraced this new Syrian National Council for Opposition and Revolutionary Forces. It is playing this game. It is playing the game of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the US, and it's not going to leave this game. And maybe it's sidelined, but it's in its side. Another thing we have been seeing in recent weeks is somewhat a relaxation of tensions, especially with Russia, but I would argue also with Iran. With Russia, we were very, very high tensions in October, but now again, coming December, we're talking again about the fact that Putin, there will be a Putin visit. With Iran also, the tensions are high, but we saw, for example, a meeting between Ahmadinejad and Erdogan in Baku in October. So there isn't some attempts to discuss with Russia and Iran what they see, to somehow try to get to some degree of agreement with them. Another option, and doesn't look very promising, but the Turks will try. They will continue to try to use this option, is to work on Turkish-US relations. Turkish-US relations have been very, very good, rather good recently. Oded in the previous panel said that there are structural problems to this relationship, but still, we have good relations between Obama and Erdogan, and Turkey can try to play on this to some degree. So these are the diplomatic options. Now, military options. And here I want to point to an article by Sonar Chaptai from the Washington Institute, a recent article. He presented 3 military scenarios with regard to what can be Turkish military response vis-a-vis Syria. So first of all, he said that basically we can have a continued low-intensity shelling, Turkish shelling, in response to Syrian shelling. This, in practice, would mean that we would have some pockets of Syrian oppositions, and these pockets would have a de facto Turkish security umbrella. But this is a very limited response military-wise. Another option he suggested is that we'll have combined shelling with cross-border raids. That basically this will be a northern Iraq scenario. Turkey from time to time will enter Syrian territory and will not ask for the authority of anyone to do so. It will do this when it feels the need to do so. And the last option he mentioned is what he termed the Cyprus scenario, a limited invasion. Now, some didn't like this analogy. They said in Cyprus it was a very different story. In Cyprus there was the Turkish ethnic kin. But I think the analogy does work to some extent in the sense that Turkey despairs from the West, like it did in Cyprus in 1974, and in the sense that Turkey takes its security in its own hands. Okay, I think this is where the analogy does work. Now let's try to assess these different scenarios. If there will be only continued shelling in response to Syrian shelling, this of course has low cost. It's not a very serious cost. The danger is that this protracted war in Syria will continue, and here many analysts point to the danger of radicalization in Syria. And of course, also if you have these you'd only do responsive shelling, then of course the refugees continue, and we're expecting rising number of refugees. If you add the cross-border operations component, well, this can help in containing the Kurdish terror problem, as it does in some respects in North Iraq. But there is a danger that Assad and Iran will use this PKK card against Turkey. How much they can really mobilize the PKK is questionable, but they will use this card, and they will use threats. It won't be, of course, official threats, but it will be a Turkish worry. So this is another danger. Intervention, and here I think don't use the term, of course, invasion. Invasion is very, very problematic. Intervention, perhaps establishments of safe havens, humanitarian corridor, all through the Syrian conflict there was talk about this. This will be a zone of influence. This will be, of course, more substantial. This is security-wise, this will have many benefits for Turkey. But of course, there's a fear of being dragged into a protracted civil war, that Turkey will become a bigger stakeholder in what is happening in Syria, and this is something the Turks are worried about, especially if you look at the Turkish public. The Turkish public, several public opinion polls have showed that the Turkish public does not want to enter Syria. And also I think it should be emphasized that even if you have this zone of influence and security-wise it will have benefits, it will not necessarily be a game changer in the terms that this will cause the fall of Assad. Okay? It will assist Turkey, but it will not necessarily solve the conflict. So my concluding remarks, in the short term, yes, the prospects are very bleak in respect to Syria, but also in respect to Turkey. We have a bloody stalemate that is here to stay. There will be continuation of the border shelling. There will be the rising number of refugees. And as I said, Syria and Iran might play on the PKK card, which is something worrisome from the Turkish perspective. However, in the medium-long term, I want to join the more optimist voice that we heard this morning. I would say that in both scenarios, Turkey basically wins. If Assad remains, and even more so if it's only a transitional government with Baathist elements, but not with Assad itself, some new modus vivendi will arise. As I said, it will be a weak Assad. He will have no interest in a conflict with Turkey. So some new modus vivendi, as was before, will arise. If the opposition succeeds, this is even better for the Turks because this is a very good basis for the future relations. Turkey has supported the opposition. Its economic influence already in Syria will grow. This economic influence will probably translate also to political clout. So in this respect, and also whatever scenario you have, we have a weak Syria. This weak Syria will be very dependent upon Turkey. So this is, in terms of Turkish politics, this is probably a rather optimistic scenario, again, but in the medium and long term. So thank you very much.